Let's go. So for those of you that may not know who I am, my name is Paul Esteves. I didn't put a photo of me up there because I felt like that was a little bit weird because I'm standing right here and then you're looking at me there and I'm in person here. I'm a 3D designer, artist, Houdini person. I don't want to get like too into titles. I like making pictures. I like using Houdini. And I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like today. I also made a reel specifically for OFFF. I haven't done a reel in 4 years, and I'm not really big on reels at the moment in my life, but I figured just to kind of show you a little bit of the work that I do. Unlike Bastion, I like everything super bright, super colorful, no contrast, just like let's go full ham. So here's my reel, and then I want to talk about Vellum. Sound?
Hey, I'm Paul, and it's Houdini time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. I must just confess, I didn't actually make this reel. I worked with a guy named Victor, who's an amazing like 2D video editor, motion designer, and I gave him all my work, and I said, "Can you make me something?" And he did. So he actually did that, not me. Shameless plug. I do also have a Patreon. I'm gonna like just throw that out there quickly now. You can check me out. We every month I take like different scenes and we build stuff. Try and like create cool new things, sometimes get inspired by other people, but I generally try and create something like brand new that is maybe inspired but not a direct copy, because I think there's enough inspiration in the world. So moving on. So I had to give a title for this talk before I was ready to give a title for this talk, because they do like printing and all these types of things. And so I actually asked ChatGPT to give me a kind of clickbait title around Vellum or around Houdini that people would like, and it gave me some like super long clickbaity thing, and I just copied and pasted to Paola from Side Effects, thinking that it was going to email me like the answer form that I filled out, and it didn't. So I actually had no idea what I sent to her until 2 weeks ago. So I kind of relabeled it as Vellum cheat sheet, and essentially what I want to talk about is just some projects that I've done personally and some of the client projects that I've done where I love to use Vellum. I find it super fun. Like there's just a lot of creativity you can do. Vellum has soft bodies, it has cloth, it has hair, it has grains. As of a few versions ago, it has like the shape match, which is like a rigid constraint. And you can just do a lot of stuff with Vellum. And so I tend to try and push it as much as I can and use it as much as I can in every project that I can. Sometimes people hire me for non-Vellum things, unfortunately. But as much as I can, I try and do that. And one of the questions that I get asked the most by people on Patreon, or I just see kind of floating around there, is how do you get attributes from SOPs into DOPs? And so I want to start off by just talking about how you can update attributes from SOPs to DOPs. And we're going to go through like a couple different, I want to call them quick tips of different things that maybe you don't know how to do in Vellum just yet, and these will help you. And SOPs to DOPs, I feel like unlocks a lot of options and a lot of possibilities in Vellum, because maybe you've encountered a situation like this where you have this weird Voronoi egg-looking thing. You probably didn't have this one because it looks kind of weird, but you have a fall-off that goes through here in SOPs. As you can see, I'm on the SOP node, and when you go to the DOP node and you hit play, you don't get the fall-off coming through, because the way that most DOP nets work is the attribute that comes in on frame 1 is the attribute that it holds onto. It doesn't update every frame unless you tell it to. And so we have to do something that makes it do this once you're on the Vellum solver, so that you're updating things. That's kind of the goal in this. And eventually what that lets you do is inflate things and deflate things and do all sorts of cool Vellum-y stuff. This is super old and It's probably not very well rendered, but you can make like super hairy egg-looking things if you want. And so I want to talk about how we do that. And I want to start by talking about points and how we can manipulate points. So in Vellum, I just want to let you know I talk very fast, so you can watch this later on YouTube in half-time speed if you want, because I have half an hour and I've got a lot to cover. So in points, there's two different things. There's points and there's primitives. There's geometry and there's constraint geometry. We're going to start with points and normal geometry. And what that lets us do is we can manipulate certain attributes with just points. So I'm starting off with a grid and a MOPS falloff. It's very fancy. This is the kind of stuff that I get hired a lot of money to do, just simple stuff. And then we're going to just create a cloth constraint. All the attributes there are completely random. I just move stuff around, try stuff, see what works. There's totally arbitrary numbers. And we are going to go into the Vellum solver. I'm going to turn off gravity so it doesn't fall away. And then I'm going to hit play. Amazing. Nothing happens because I have no forces, nothing's happening, it's a bit anticlimactic. Of course, I have to go inside, I have to do something, so I'm going to add a pop wind. So we have some amazing looking cloth that's very violently swaying around. And of course, this is not using MOPS falloff at all. It's not doing anything. So we want to do something. And one of the ways that you can do this is on the pop wind, it has an inputs tab. So we can go into the inputs tab and we can just go and fetch our MOPS falloff. And I created a null there that says out MOPS. So I'm just going, I'm fetching that, and I'm bringing that into the MOPS wind. And in MOPS wind, there's a expression. You just write a little bit of code. And all I'm doing here is I'm using a point function, which reads a point value. And I'm reading the MOPS falloff, and I'm multiplying the amplitude of the wind by the MOPS falloff. It's very basic, and when we hit play, now the MOPS falloff is going to bring in a pop wind. Fairly amazing. You don't have to clap. I know I'm going fast, so there's no time for clapping. Otherwise, you would. It's cool. One of the problems with this, though, is that every time you add another pop force or some sort of pop whatever, you have to go into the input. You have to bring in, go fetch the out and ops, and then you have to use a point function. It's a bit tedious, especially when your networks start growing and you do things a little bit fancier than this. And so what I like to do is I like to use a pop wrangle. So this is a little bit more vexed. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go and fetch our MOPS in the input context. And then in the wrangle, we're going to do exactly the same thing we just did with a point function, but we're going to write it out to an attribute. And so what this opens up for us now is we have this f at MOPS. I'm writing an attribute. It's updated every frame, and I can use it wherever I want. So if I go into my pop wind, in my expression, instead of using a point function, I can now just reference that MOPS that I've created in the pop wrangle, and I get exactly the same thing. But what's cool with this is this now opens up a lot of possibilities, because I'm going to now turn off the expression. So if I hit play now, or actually I skipped it, but the pop wind is affecting everything, and I'm going to drop down a Vellum constraint, and I'm going to set this to pin to target. And there's a couple different pin to target nodes. I did a little short video on it. You can go find it on YouTube. But essentially, I'm going to use stopped, and the way that stopped works is it's a 0 to 1 attribute, or 0 or 1. It's either one or the other, and I can pin things. And now, instead of affecting the wind, I'm actually going to affect pin points. So I'm going to duplicate a pop wrangle. I'm going to have a second one. And in the second one, I don't need any inputs. All I want to do is I want to write to this new attribute, the stopped attribute, and I'm going to affect it by MOPS. But I just need to invert that, so I can say 1 minus MOPS so that it's the other way around. And again, I get exactly the same thing. So, I mean, it's a little bit repetitive here, but you can kind of start to get some pretty interesting shapes. So now, if I have a falloff that goes 0, 1, 0, instead of just 0 and 1, that sounded scary. Now, as the wind is released, you can actually freeze it, because the falloff comes in and it pins those points. So you start to get something a little bit different. So this is like pretty arbitrary. I worked with my friend Rolando Barry. I don't know if he's in this room. His other friends, no, he didn't come. Okay, that's fine. He's amazing. He's a super talented artist. He did like all the rendering, and it was a project that a studio commissioned us for like an internal thing, and we spent, I think, a week, maybe 2 weeks, and we did like this whole cloth thing. And one of the shots was they wanted to show like cloth being ironed out, and I used the same thing, just a fall off, and I did some pinning, and then he made it look super cool with some rendering. But just taking very simple concepts, and once you start getting those fall-offs into DOPs, it starts to open up a lot of possibilities. Okay, so here's some more possibilities you can do. In the top right, you can see I'm doing the same thing where I'm just pinning stuff. taking the same thing, instead of having a fall off that grows out, I just use this long, thin noise that moves all over the place. You can have a sphere that expands. You can have fall offs going through a random cross shape. I think somebody did that on Instagram. I copied it. And I tend to do that a lot. I tend to see cool stuff on Instagram, and then I try and copy it, and then generally I don't show anyone like I'm showing now, because the goal for me is often just to like see if I can recreate some stuff and then keep it hidden away, and then I make a GIF of it or I make an MP4 of it, and I have an explorations folder, so that when I get onto a project, if there's like an R&D time, whatever, I'm not like, oh, I have no idea what I'm going to do. I can just kind of scroll through my folder and see, oh, maybe that would work. Let me try that, and I don't have to start from scratch. But I have a whole bunch of pre-built scenes that I can very easily try the client's project, the client's product in, or the studio, whatever they want to do. So I really encourage you to find stuff and recreate stuff, and then not post it, because we don't want to post other people's work, but we want to try and recreate it and see, like how that works and figure it out. So we've spoken about point attributes, and the other two ones, the one that like expands the, I don't know, the little blobby thing that goes up and big, and the one in the bottom where it expands out and gets all blobby, those are now working on primitive constraint geometry. And I want to talk about that. And I showed you here, look, on the points, there's certain attributes, and on the primitive attributes, you see rest length and stuff, just to really drive it home. And I use my insanely good VFX skills to show you the three methods that I want to present to you today. I hear there's a new Matrix movie. Maybe they'll hire me to do some of the VFX shots. That would be amazing. I'll send them this as my reel. The first one we're going to start with is the geometry wrangle. And I've kind of fallen into the pattern of using this one the most. And I'm going to go from the most vex heavy all the way to one that uses no vex. So if you're not into coding and you're like, oh, I don't want to use Houdini, it's too coding heavy, I'll give you one that just uses all nodes. And it works the same. All three of these, just like I've shown you before, they do the same thing. I like to use vex. I feel smart when I use vex, so vex the planet. We're going to start with a geometry wrangle, and the difference between a geometry wrangle and a pop wrangle is a geometry wrangle runs over primitives or points or detail attribute. It can run over anything, whereas a pop wrangle, because of its name, pop, it only runs on particles or on points. And so in this one, what we want to do is we want to run over primitives, because rest length or stiffness, as I've said multiple times, it runs on primitives. And again, we want to run over the constraint geometry. On the inputs tab, I'm just kind of filling out some inputs. And I didn't come up with this. I just copied side effects. When in doubt, do what side effects does. And in the Vellum constraint property, I did what they did in their inputs. So I just did it in my own geometry wrangle. And then in the third input, I'm referencing mops, just like we did in the pop wrangle. Okay, so it's like just getting these basics out of the way. We can dive into some vex. And I'm not going to break this down exactly like you can watch it and copy it. It's pretty self-explanatory if you know a little bit of vex. And if you don't, nothing I say is going to help you. No, I'm joking. Basically, we're on a primitive wrangle, and mops is a point attribute at this point. So we need to use a prim points function to bring it in so we can read it with a point attribute. And then mops is 0 to 1, but I don't want 0 to 1. I want 1 in some random value, or 2 random values. So I'm going to use a fit01 function and fit it to something. There it is. You can use it. When this comes out, you can copy and paste it. And then what this lets me do is just lets me adjust the rest length. Now this is, again, it's not like super fancy, but we'll get somewhere fancier maybe later. But this is the basic of this. And you can use this to do an infinite amount of things. Okay, but I promised you 3 different methods. So the second method, that's going to do exactly the same thing. But here we go. We're going to use a Vellum constraint property. And this node is pretty cool. It has some very cool functions. It has some confusing functions too. The naming of it I find confusing for me, but we'll set it up anyway. First, we're going to use the groups, stretch and bend, so that we can tell it exactly what groups we want to work on. And these are the stretch and bend constraints in the cloth, the Vellum cloth. And then like we've done before, we're going to go into the reach the out mops, the null that we were referencing. And then, like we did before, we're going to use the little expression box at the bottom, and we can write in and multiply our rest scale, or our rest length scale. This is what I said, the naming's a bit weird. It's rest length scale, but then you write rest scale. And we do exactly the same thing as we did before. We use a point function, then we're going to fit it, and then we're going to multiply by it. Something you can note here is that I'm using @ptnum inside the point function, which is actually wrong. I should use prim points as I did before, but as has been pointed out many times to me, you can use ptnum and it works. So it's not technically right, but it does work. And as you can see, the result is staggeringly cool. You get this really weird looking cloth. And if I show it compared to the geometry angle, it is the same thing. Okay, so we have two methods. The last method is a SOP solver, and this is super powerful. What a SOP solver does is it gives you SOP context inside DOPs. So you've gone from SOPs into DOPs back into SOPs. So it's kind of like a multi-layer thing. I don't really like it though because there's a lot of clicking. You have to go into so many layers, and then every time you want to iterate, you have to jump in layers and click out, and it just gets a little bit tedious for me. But I promised you no vex, so here we go. First, we set up constraint geometry. Then we're going to dive inside, and we're going to use an object merge, and we're going to object merge in our out mops. So we have mops inside of our SOP solver. And then we don't have to use any vex to transfer our attributes. We can just use an attribute transfer because we're in SOP land now. But we need to get from points to primitives, so we use an attribute promote. And then we are going to use a primitive up, and what we need to do is we need to bring in our two attributes that we want to affect. In this case, we want to use our mops falloff, and the other one we want to use is our rest length orange. And this is an attribute that Vellum sets up when you pipe something into Vellum cloth. It sets up these default values, and we want to multiply our mops falloff by this with the fitted values, so I'll use a fit function. And then finally, we just want to write this out to rest length. So slow typing, and then when I hit play, I get the same thing. So now you have three methods to get attributes from SOPs into DOPs. And this is a pretty lame example, but it's a pretty powerful concept. As I said, three things. I just wanted to show my amazing VFX work again. I was very proud of this work that I did. So I want to talk about this project. Another one that I did with Rolando, actually. It was done ages ago, but it was a fun one. And I've seen a lot of people try and recreate it over the years, even recently. So I thought I'd just tell you how I did it because it's really basic. As you can see, my scene graph, just like Simon's and XK's, is really big. Not really. I used a grid, I remeshed it, I extruded it, and then I used two copy transform nodes to make like a grid of grids. And then what I did was I used an assemble node to pack each of these grids so that when my falloff goes through, it affects each grid like each grid as a whole rather than each point of the grid. So that like as these inflate, they don't inflate gradually, but it's like a bam, bam, bam effect. And that worked out. And then in my pressure constraint, I'm adding a second Vellum constraint. I'm adding a pressure. I'm setting this to P stretch. So now what I can do is I can affect my pressure constraints separately to my cloth constraints. So when I dive in here, you can see I have my geometry angle, exactly what I've already explained. Same input, same constraint geometry, same everything. I'm just running over my P stretch group, and you can see I'm setting a value of 1 and 120. So when I hit play, you get these like jelly looking like pillows. Not quite what Rolando and I made. So we can kind of further iterate this. You don't have to stop there. Now we can add a second geometry wrangle and just affect the stretch and the bend constraints with exactly the same code. And now I'm just going to increase those by a very little bit. So instead of 1 and 120 like I did with pressure, I'm just going to do 1 and 1.2. And now you start to get just a little bit more wrinkles. It feels a little bit nicer, but it's still not quite where I wanted it to be. And so I started playing around with some different random falloffs like this one here, which this was before the attribute or the mask along geometry and all those nodes, so I had to kind of manually force my way through it. And what I did was I just created a mask from the outside in, and I had some controls, and then I multiplied this with my Vellum falloff. So as it inflates, the edges are still shrinking, or the edges shrink and the middle expands. And if you look at a single pillow, you can kind of see how that looks now. Instead of like just a big blobby thing, you get this kind of like more, I don't know, fluffy feeling pillow. And when you make a whole bunch of them that are slightly different just because of the way that the simulation runs, it starts to feel a little bit cooler. And then you just have to give it to Rolando and he makes it look cool. Now, the same technique is used in every single one of these projects. Nothing is different. It's exactly the same geometry angle. If you're part of my Patreon, you already know this. I use a geometry angle for each of these projects. This is the way you do any sort of inflation. You can use the geometry angle, you can use a Vellum constraint property, or you can use a SOP solver. there's so many options once you start exploring this that it's really, really, really crucial that if you want to get into Houdini and you want to start doing Vellum stuff, that you practice or you find a method that works for you that you can get attributes in and you can start manipulating things. Of course, you can do really silly things like this. This is one of my very first things I made in Houdini. So proud of it. It's amazing. Okay, so this next thing, completely unrelated to what we just spoke about. I want to talk about wrinkles. And I use this on a project that I can't show, as most of us all know. So I made this really bad jellyfish that kind of demonstrates what I want to talk about. And that's giving a really basic input shape. And this is using a lot of Luke Van's tools. They're free. You can find them on GitHub. Luke Van does a whole bunch of really cool stuff. He has like this cycle thing, and you just like drop it in there, and it made the left side. So it's really quick. And then I want to talk about how we can very easily get those cool little details and wrinkles and stuff with Vellum on the right while maintaining the overall shape of the object. So another one is like if you use a piece of cloth on the top, what is that, left, and then you can kind of get a little bit more detail and a little bit more coolness on the bottom right. And the time difference is just because I slowed down one and I forgot to slow down the other one in post. It's all good. So the way that this worked was I had a grid and I did an amazing Vellum simulation with pop wind. And often what I like to do with pop wind is I like to do like a big wind and a small wind. So like one that adds the big details and then one that adds the small details. And when you see the simulation, you'll see all the small details. And not really, because it's a very low res sim. And I purposefully made this like extremely like bad, just to kind of show like what you can do with this. So you have like this really low res sim, which often I get sent to by studios that have done this in Cinema 4D and they want it to look better. So they call me in and they give me this and they say, can you add like wrinkles and make it look cooler? And so what you can do is you can clean it, get rid of all the Vellum attributes. Now I just have my UVs and I'm going to subdivide it a whole lot. So I have a lot of tiny little triangles on my cloth. And then a trick that John Kunz taught me, he's sitting over there, very clever, is you time shift your geometry and then you create your Vellum constraints on static geometry and then use an attribute copy to get the moving geometry onto the Vellum constraints. And then you use a pin to target the animation. So the pin to target node is the node that's going to kind of dictate how much Vellum we have and how much wrinkles we have. And before we get to the pin to target, we need to go to our Vellum cloth and we need to lower our bend stiffness a lot, like negative, what is it, 1e minus 9 or 1e minus 10. So it's like infinitely bend. And the bend constraint is how much wrinkles, like how much it can bend over itself. And then the pin constraint is how much do I want it to follow my original animation and how much do I want Vellum's influence on my like project. And I use some random values and you get this. So you can imagine that from an original thing to this, you get all these nice secondary details. And then just because I love you guys so much, I did some further explorations where I did some amazing character modeling and I made this thing with an attribute noise. And what I did here was I used the distance along geometry just to kind of get like an attribute and then I displaced the sides with noise and it feels like a very sick manta ray, and then I used a lab sine wave to like move it around. And then if you run this through this exact same setup that we've just spoken about, you start to get something that's kind of cool and different and weird and random. And maybe you don't like this and you want to try something else. Well, you can use wedging, which Simon's already shown us how powerful that can be. And you can get like cool different results. Just playing with different like pressure stiffness, playing with different pin stiffness, so some are super pin, some are less pin, so they go a bit crazy. Some inflate, I tried like some inflation stuff. And of course you could combine SOPs to DOPs that we just spoke about. You can run some noises through this, so that some areas inflate more than others, and you can go wild. But the whole thing of adding wrinkles has been super cool on certain projects, which won't be named. You can also render it, and it looks like that. Cool. I also did a worm. And then when you run it through and you loop it, now you have an infinitely looping worm. And I'm going to drink some water while you wait for it to end. And there's the jellyfish, and you can render the jellyfish. And you can add in some cool tentacles, and there were some intersections that like look like lightning, but yeah. So I also want to talk about how you can disable stuff, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up my voice even more. We're going to start with a sphere, and maybe you've run into this problem. I know there's some people here that they've actually Discorded me already, and like DM'd me on Discord, and asked me how to solve this, and I've had this problem, so if you haven't, you probably will, and then you can come back. But sometimes you have a sphere, or any geometry, and you use a hair gen, you put some hair on there, and then you want to pin the roots, so you create a root group, and you pin them in the Vellum hair. And without any forces, without anything, you expect nothing to happen, but when you hit play, you get this really weird behavior, which is unexpected and not cool. And the reason that I figured this has happened with my scientific testing is that you have a pinned point on your sphere, but you're also using your sphere as a collider, and that point is trying to not be collided with, and yeah, there's a whole bunch of problems. And what you can use is this little thing here called disable external. And all you have to do is use your root group, say disable external equals 1, and it's going to take that group and it's going to exclude it from the collisions of the external geometry. And now when you hit play, nothing happens, because nothing should happen. But if you add some wind or you add some deformation to your sphere, now everything works as it should. And it's been super handy, and this like one thing has tripped me up for half a day trying to figure out why this is not working. So now you don't have to run into the same problem. And of course you can push this further, and something that people often ask me is how can you kind of link Vellum hair and Vellum cloth at the same time. So I want to quickly talk about that, which is completely unrelated to this topic, but it's a cool one. What you can do is you can use a Vellum hair simulation, and then you can use a guide deform so that your hair is moving with your moving mesh. It's kind of like a point deform, but specifically made for hair gen, and it's good. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, okay, this isn't moving. Yep, move along, Paul. So then we're going to create the group, but what we're not going to do is we're not going to pin it in the Vellum hair. Because on the right side of the stream, we're going to create a Vellum cloth, and we're going to pin that Vellum cloth, and then we are going to use a Vellum glue node so that we're pinning those points onto our Vellum cloth. So those hairs are now kind of pinning onto the cloth, so we can now run that through, and as our Vellum is doing some crazy cool movement, those hairs are following suit and doing the same thing. And as these are just curves, I've spoken about this before at a Houdini hug in Munich. It's online on SideFX's channel. Those are just hairs. You can just path deform through Vex or the SideFX one. You can just path deform some Megascans assets or some flower assets onto the curves, because each curve can just put a little flower on there. And now you get that really cool organic movement of hair, but with a plant simulation. And I thought it was kind of cool. You guys don't seem so impressed. Fine, I'll move on. Back to work. No, you don't have to clap now. It's too late. You missed it. So this one was a cool one that I got to work with Yambo Studios. Yambo's amazing. I love working with him. We were working on the OFFF Tel Aviv titles, which was supposed to happen last October, but didn't because of certain world events, which was super unfortunate. But it was a fun project because there was no budget, which is always fun, and there was no real time constrictions. So we kind of got to work on this whenever we had free time, and whenever there was like a gap in our schedules, we would try and sync up and try and create something. And we made this cool blobby thing. We made a whole bunch of other things, but we made this cool blobby thing as one of them. And he wanted these spheres to kind of like break out of this, I don't know, this shell thing. And so I started with like the typical where it like just breaks out. And he wanted, and what I love about art directors is when they come up with cool, complex things that I don't know how to do. And what he wanted was, he wanted it to break out of the mesh, but the mesh itself would stay intact, kind of like a membrane. He wanted this to feel organic and membraney and not just like crack open. And so I had to try and figure out what this would look like. And as we're talking about like disabling stuff, this is what I came up with. I figured, well, if I can just disable certain areas of one Vellum part to the other Vellum part, peace, Chris. I've got 2 minutes. Okay. If you can disable one like part of the Vellum to the other part of the Vellum, this would work. And so what I did was I created these little small spheres that are going to inflate, and the shell that's going to inflate. And then I'm going to go into the solver, and there's a couple things happening here, but basically I'm using a Vellum constraint property to inflate both the shell and the little spheres. And as they inflate, they're putting stress on the big shell. And if you calculate the stress, let's skip through some of this stuff. you can use this to get stress, and as you calculate the stress, you can use this back in Vellum. So you can calculate it and then you can use it. And what I did was I just used this to disable self on the shell group. So one group of Vellum is disabling itself from the other when the stress gets high enough. So they push out, you get this cool interaction, and then they slowly break through. But then the shell itself kind of like shrinks on itself because there's nothing inside pushing it. And I really wanted to kind of take this further and like really explore this, but the project never continued, and we were going to start it again, and we never did. And so this is kind of where it ended up. But the whole thing of disabling stuff and Vellum attributes is super fun and super cool. And yeah, this is the final. And there's a Vellum attributes page, and I encourage you to go and like read through this because we're always bored and we don't know what to do. We can go read through the Vellum attributes page. And I encourage you, like I said earlier, to take like 1 or 2 of these attributes and then try and see what you can do with it and create some demo files. And even if it's nothing fancy, like a lot of what I've shown you, if you have a folder of a bunch of explorations of little tricks that you've learned how to do, like disable stuff, when you get into a project, you're like, oh, that could work. And how does that work? Well, I've got a file that tells me, and you don't have to spend half a day, reading and going through research trying to figure it out because you've already explored it. And I think that's super useful, especially as a freelancer who gets kind of like dumped with a whole bunch of random stuff sometimes that you're not sure how to do. It helps to have previous R&D that you've done for yourself. And I have 1 minute because I had to, so now you can ask me anything. Okay, time's up. Let's go. Is there time for questions? No? Yeah? Okay. You can ask a question if you're good.
First of all, terrific talk. If anyone hasn't tried Vellum yet, it's known to be one of the most approachable ways of using Houdini. It's a good way to get into Houdini and have fun. Yeah. So I'm really glad that you were able to do this and provide a cheat sheet into getting into it. Any questions? Everything was answered. Yeah,
I was obviously so clear. That's amazing.
You talked so fast that people are like, I don't even know what to ask.
I don't even know what he said. I've missed all of it. Okay, fun. Cool.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Excellent.